Assalamualaikum and a very good day to Dr. Song. We have compiled data and information titled Suicide Among Teens. This is to create awareness to all, especially teens and parents, about suicide and how to prevent it. Suicide is preventable if you know how to tackle it. Suicide mainly root from feeling trapped in the problem where they feel like there is no way out. According to Wasserman et al., suicide is an act of taking one's life or self-inflicted death. This is alarming, especially in among teens. The trend is increasing alarming across the globe. It is said to be that culture has strong influence in suicidal. Goldstein 2008 stated suicidal behavior determined by the role of religion, family, and distress manifestation in the different cultural contexts. Asian and Western countries hold different suicidal trend, mostly in developing countries. In Malaysia, suicidal behavior research are very little focusing on the younger generation than the adults generation, but it is becoming the most discussed issue following the usage of social media that link to the suicidal behavior. Following of the COVID-19 pandemic, corresponds to the personal problem like financial problems, isolation, severe stress, family problem, and so on. Suicide is increasingly alarming state. In 2019, the Star had reported that suicide among teens is the second most leading cause of death in this generation. That is a case whereby a 16-year-old girl in Kuching who posted a poll in her Instagram showing her contemplation of death or to live. The poll triggered her to take her own life as 70% of the respondents voted for her death. Availability of some chemical that were once popular for suicidal bits in Malaysia made suicidal behavior increasing. Suicidal feelings usually short-term and specific to the surrounding of the person. Most people who has been attempted with suicide often have ambivalent feelings to take their own life. It is also reported that booming with technology, especially in social media, had contributed to the mental health problem in the latest generation with negative psychological symptoms. From 2008 to 2017, young teens and young adults with suicidal thoughts and also depression increased by 47%, but not correspond with older adults. There are many variables in contributing suicide cases. Number 1 is between genders. The National Health and Morbidity Surveys NHMS 2017 found that suicidal behavior among Malaysian teens increased from 7.9% in 2012 to 10% in 2017. We can see that suicidal ideation also increased from 6.4% to 7.3%. At the same time as the suicidal attempts rose from 6.8% to 6.9%. Teenage girls tend to have higher suicidal behaviors than boys. Number 2, depression, anxiety, and stress. Based on the image above, we can see that 1 out of 5 Malaysian teens suffered from depression, while other 40% were anxious and 10% were stressed. Sabahan teens have the highest levels of anxiety, which at 47.8%. Teens that live in Selangor have the highest depression rate and stress level. Among the ethnicity, Indian teens have the most depression rate, which is 33%, anxiety 47%, and stress 15% compared to others. Number 3, physically and verbally abused. Almost half of teens in Malaysia are verbally abused. 1 out of 10 teenagers are physically abused, while 40% complain to be verbally abused at home. 30% of boys are physically abused, while girls are 11%. 49% of boys suffered from verbal abuse, while girls is 37%. Distribution in the form of forms in high school are shown in the image. Other than that, social media contributes to many mental health issues among teens. Teens reported that Instagram are the highest contributors in suicidal behaviors. Looking at someone else's life in that particular social media application, which always portrays the good side, also made teenagers have low self-esteem, poor body image, poor sleep, cyberbullying, and many more. Other than that, lifestyle and personal problems like role in family, socioeconomics of a family, and other problems like verbal and physical abuse, mental state of teenager like depression, anxiety, and stress are the main contributors to teen suicide. There are many suicide warnings, signs that as you can see in the image.
A report from the World Health Organization stating that close to almost 800,000 people die by suicide every year. Furthermore, for each suicide, there are more than 20 attempts. Suicides and suicide attempts have a ripple effect that impacts on family, friends, colleagues, communities, and even societies. It is important to understand that suicide is preventable. Much can be done to prevent suicide at individual, community, and national level.
Although suicide is a difficult topic to discuss, it is an important one because prevention methods need to be improved. Based on a professor from Menninger Department of Psychiatric and Behavior, he has mentioned suicide has been a major concern for the psychiatric mental field and in the broad field of medicine for decades. The problem has haunted suicide researchers is that on one hand we know a lot about the risk factors for suicide. However, on the other hand, accurately predicting whether or not an individual patient who may have a number of risk factors is going to be someone who dies by suicide is not something that we are good at. While knowing the risk factors is helpful, we need to improve the prevention. What's the need to talk about this topic and spreading the knowledge to the respective community? People condemn, people judge, people put down the victims who have attempted suicide despite knowing the real story. This happens because stigma of mental health still remains as a discrimination among the living society. Instead of working on helping intervention, the stigma happens to be an additional burden to this affected individual's pain. This phenomena has to come to an end as suicide is definitely a preventive act. With that, we see many campaigns and programs are being conducted to promote on importance of raising the awareness of teen suicide. This issue serves as the alertness and contributes to the responsiveness towards the suicide individuals as the awareness circulates among the public on a higher rate. On the ongoing knowledge of importance in raising continuous awareness regarding suicide teens, we also need to be reminded that this knowledge needs to reach the specific group of person to make necessary steps before things goes out of hand. It takes the whole community to take responsibility in playing their role to help prevent this psychic issue running around the teens who are in serious help. So, to whom does this issue concern to, and how can this specific group of people help contribute in preventing teen suicide? To begin with the ones nearest to the teens in the longest period, peers and friends. Being a friend, you are at the best place to identify your friend if they are in need of any help. Despite being in a situation in an anxiety or a sorrow, be aware of your peers' talk and body language. Your friend could be portraying the signs while having a group talk or a simple discussion. The person recognizing the signs, second-hand signs, or just at times you might see them posting stuff and sharing it online on social media. Do not ignore these signs. If you find your friend portraying an abnormal behavior, try to talk it to an adult like their parents or even your school teacher who can make way to solve this issue. Your first move could save a friend's life. Moving on to the second group of people who also take an important role in preventing teen suicide. Family, which means parents, siblings, and anyone that lives in the same household with the teens. Keeping a perfect home not necessarily mean everything is alright. It is understandable how teens are growing and they are building their own world that on most cases involves the group of people similar in their category, which makes parenting a little more challenging. However, that doesn't mean they solely not take note of what's happening in their children's life. Parents are advised to be more acknowledging on the signs of these suicide acts, being more insightful of how to handle and communicate with your children. This always happens when you make space, being a parent, to make your children be more approaching to you. Always be a person they can depend on to share their thoughts in how stressful their situation can be. Educators and school play a second tutor role in shaping the teen's life. Besides just grades and marks and exams, providing knowledge on these suicide issues also happens to prevent teen suicide. It is important to emphasize the function of school counselors' job beyond just when there are issues in schools or there's a problem with a kid. Allocate a period in the timetable for students to have a mind-free session. This session could help and create space for students to talk their issues or probably just their week of how they have been going through with their school, with their life, in their home, and anything necessary that it gives them a safe space that they can always approach these tutors at any point. So, how about the people outside the circle of these teens? How do they serve an importance to this issue? The government, the non-governmental, healthcare services, and even social media. Like the government, they have organized a National Suicide Prevention Awareness Month, which happens to be on September. This happens to be a nationwide strategy that helps serve to the public with the collaboration of this non-governmental organization. They usually happen to organize events like a fundraising walk, and this happens to be an awareness in contributing to suicide prevention efforts. Not forgetting the healthcare services who could provide counseling. They could approach their psychiatrists when symptoms happen to worse, suggesting interventions for these victims to follow, or even non-pharmaceutical options are encouraged by these professions when medications don't make ways for the teen's recovery. A simple act like posting on social media, you could help save a life unknowingly. From all these people around these teens, the main person who serves as a role to help prevent this teen suicide is the individual by themselves. The young generation at this living era have a misconception that as they grow up, they carry a set of loads, which are their responsibilities, that they need to manage on their own. Asking for help may seem like a bad thing, or it is significant to them as a failure during the process of their independence. Relating with that, they turn to pressurize things within and become reluctant towards seeking professional help due to the mental health stigma. And similarly, they tend to suppress these thoughts by not even sharing to their peers. Being an individual, being a teenager, it is important in understanding the vulnerability of life. Every day is something new to learn and experience. And if there's an issue, there's always someone there to talk to.
Globally, suicide among teenagers remain a major public health hazard. There are few research about suicide among teenagers found that the main risk factors of suicide are mental illness, family history of suicide, cyberbullying, usage of alcohol, previous suicide attempts, personality characteristics, and specific life event traits. The factors that influence a teenager to commit suicide depend on individual life situation. The suicide risk factor in every country rate differently. The majority of researchers conclude that suicide is closely related to mental illness. Mental illness have been shown to increase between 47 to 74% of the probability of suicide cases among youth. According to studies, a recent suicide attempt resulted almost 25 to 33%, and it became a disease which is more frequent in boys than in girls. The probability of suicide is shown to be mostly linked to the personality behavior itself. Rather than the intensity of suicide attempt of the act, the personality characteristics teenagers who have attempted suicide have less problem-solving skill than their friend. Their attitude was defined by a very conservative approach, whether they hope for somebody to solve any simple or complicated problems on behalf of them. Move on to family history factors. In various studies, several risk factor-related family dynamic
and mechanisms have been linked to suicidal activity. It is believed that family causes play a role in 50% of youth suicide cases. The factor of family history occurs when teens have poor communication with family members, and direct clashes with parents have a significant effect, but so can a lack of communication and an inability to acknowledge communication needs can make teens to suicide. Next will be specific life event rate. The risk factor closely related to particular critical life experiences may be very varied, although certain forms of cases stresses are shown to be more often associated with teenage suicide than others. Interpersonal tragedies such as relationship breakups, friend death, and family rejection can have a significant effect on teenagers and are involved in 1/5 of all teen suicide cases. The table shows the comparison of suicide factors rate between Malaysia, USA, and Canada. As we all know, USA and Canada is a country which have highest ranking on suicide cases among teens. The most risk factor of suicide cases among teens are mental illness, previous suicide attempt, cyberbullying, and usage of alcohol. According to the report, the country that have highest number of teens commit suicide due to usage of alcohol is in USA, which is around 31,953 teenagers, while in Canada is 25 to 30% of teenagers, and Malaysia record the least, which is 9.5% of teenagers who commit suicide due to the usage of alcohol. And the next will be previous suicide attempt. Canada record as the most cases of suicide, which is around 22,064 teenagers, and in USA is 6,483, and in Malaysia is 53% of teenagers. Currently, suicide cases among teens due to cyberbullying increase in every country. Canada reported the most suicide attempt, which is 2,999 teenagers because of the cyberbullying factor, and in USA is 661 teenagers, and Malaysia still record the least, which is 1.5% of teenagers commit suicide due to cyberbullying. And furthermore, mental illness, which consists of depression, anxiety, and stress, are the major factor of suicide attempt among teens. Depression criteria, which identified in 50 to 65% of suicidal cases, with female being more likely than males to meet these criteria. Researchers found that the most suicide cases due to the factor of mental illness happen in USA, which is 77,490 teenagers, and in Canada is 42% of teenagers.
The first theory that I would like to explain is interpersonal theory of suicide. This theory was introduced by Thomas Joyner in 2005. Joyner introduced a framework by which suicidal ideation and the progression from ideation to attempts were treated as separate processes that come with separate sets of explanation and risk factor. Joyner proposed a specific application of the framework. Perception of low belongingness and high burdensomeness combine to bring out desire for suicide, whereas high capability for suicide facilitates potentially lethal suicide attempts. The second theory that we would like to see is Durkheim's theory of suicide. According to Durkheim, suicide refers to every case of death resulting directly or indirectly from a positive or negative death performed by the victim himself and which strive to produce this result. It is clear from the definition of Durkheim that suicide is a conscious act and the person concerned is fully aware of its consequences. The person who shoots himself to death or drinks severe poison or jumps down from the 10th story of a building, for example, is fully aware of the consequences of such an act. The third theory I would like to explain is escape theory of suicide. Roy Boymister proposed an escape theory of suicide. It describes a series steps of leading up to serious suicidal behavior. First, individual experiences a negative and severe discrepancy between expectation and actual events. Second, an aversive state of high self-awareness develops which produces negative effect. A person may dwell on personal inadequacies, leading to distress, sadness, and worry. Third, person attempts to escape from negative affect as well as from the evasive self-awareness by retreating into a numb state of cognitive reconstruction. Person regrets, meaning thoughts about self and replace them with lower level, more immediate goal and task. Reduced inhibition results which lead to a lack of impulse control in general, particularly with respect to suicidal behavior.
Ways to prevent suicide. Suicidal teenagers generally showing warning signs of distress. Parents, educators, and classmates are strongly encouraged to detect these warning signs and assist their friends and children. Let's see the ways to prevent suicide. Recognize the warning sign, be a good listener, don't leave them alone, and encourage them to see a mental health professional. Within the field of psychology, experts are bringing their unique skill to bear on the problem of suicide. Basic scientists are exploring brain changes and risk factors associated with suicidal ideation and behavior. Advanced and developing countries are also experience the pain of suicide. According to the data from the World Health Organization, 85% of the suicide in the world occur in low and middle income countries. In many developing countries, suicidal remains a taboo subject because of political, religious, or social sensitivities. These studies demonstrate that national suicide prevention programs are effective, but these effects seems to be correlated with age and sex. The data shown in the journal statistical significant declines in suicide rates in the developed country in males with the strongest effect in groups aged 25 to 44 years. Intervention should be considered in developing countries. Given the great difference between countries and religions, there can be non-standard model of suicide prevention. Each country must first conduct its own research on the risk factors and protective factors for suicidal behavior in its different communities, for example, urban and rural communities, different age groups, and then develop and test the prevention strategies that are most feasible, affordable, and likely to produce substantial decrease in the rates of suicide behavior. For example, in China, they have proposed the following types of intervention: restricting access to suicidal, particularly pesticide and high dose of drugs, expanding social support networks for high-risk groups. Next, implementing health promotion campaigns to cure on mental health and suicide. Next is improving health providers' ability to recognize and manage the psychiatric problem associated with suicide.
As a conclusion, suicidal is an occurrence that is preventable. By recognizing the signs and symptoms of suicide and knowing the available resources, then a person could react immediately to prevent teenage suicide. If a person has knowledge about a teenager being suicidal, then that person can help the suicidal teenager and let them know there are people out in the world that care about them. The suicidal teenager is not being rejected. It is important for teenagers to recognize the importance of acting quickly to deter their peers from committing suicide. A teenager who is thinking about suicide should talk to one of their friends or family members who have a lot of information about how to deal with suicide, so the friend or family member can help. The friends or family member of a suicidal teenager can also get help from a counselor or doctor if things get worse. Overall, it's time which causes the most damage, time to let these negative feelings bubble under the surface. When the pressure begins to reach higher level, teenagers begin to attempt suicide. By stepping in early and eliminating these risk factors, the rate of teen suicide can go down. Thank you.